We have Ched Myers with us here to help us reflect on the Lenten journey. Right now, Ched is an ongoing friend of Edge. He's done a number of webinars for us and some further learning circle work. He's taught at a number of theological colleges, including Emmanuel College here in Toronto, currently working with the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries. And I've heard Ted speak on a number of occasions, both in the webinars and in plenary presentations, and it's just, Ched, you do a wonderful job of opening up a prophetic, vital, transformative articulation of what we used to call the social gospel, how gospel and how our faith and community life are actually about the same thing. It's always good to hear you, and I'm grateful you could take the time to be with us today. So we'll just, at this point, Ched, I'll turn it over to you, and again, we'll stop at periods for consultation, and I'm going to disappear for a bit so that you can have more of the screen for your slide presentation.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. This is maybe the third or fourth Edge webinar I've done, and really appreciate collaborating with this important ministry, experimental ministry of the United Church of Canada. And welcome to all of you from across Canada, particularly those of you from Saskatchewan, because my wife Elaine is from Saskatchewan, so we spend a lot of time up there. So I want to talk about Lent and do a little bit of thinking ahead about preaching through Lent. Lent, I find, is something by and large our churches are confused about. Lent is a verb. I think that's fair to say. But is it really only about the traditional personal pieties of prayer, fasting, almsgiving? That's deep in our tradition, and those things are important spiritual disciplines. But is there a deeper meaning to Lent? And I want to suggest in this webinar that there's a lot going on in the Lenten journey, and the best way to open that up is to look at our scriptures. So, as is my usual task in these matters, my job is to try to push against our tendency in our churches to over-spiritualize Lent in this case, to help undomesticate the tradition and recontextualize it in the real world. So as is my practice, I want to let the Scripture take the lead in this. And of course this year in the Revised Common Lectionary we are in the year of the third Gospel, the Gospel according to Luke. Now here's a chart of the Gospel readings, of all the readings for the Lenten year this year out of the Revised Common Lectionary. In this webinar, we're going to focus on the Lucan readings, which are commence in the first Sunday of Lent. And I'm going to spend most of my time on the reading for First Lent for reasons hopefully that'll become clear as we go. I think it really sets the context for Lent and opens up the theme that persists throughout this season, namely what we might call the politics of Jesus. And then toward the end, I'll just make brief comments on the other gospel readings. Now, in order to properly understand anything, especially a story, we need to set a context, and I think that's very important for the preacher to do. Without context, the story can easily become a fairy tale or a kind of a Rorschach projection of our own fantasies. All too often, this is what happens in our churches with the gospel. And once we overlay the functional narrative of Lent, which is often vaguely defined by us as a sort of inward journey of self-examination, which it is, but it's not only that, well, it's easy to get lost on the Lenten journey. So while Lent does invite us individually and collectively to a journey, it's important in our preaching, I think, that we emphasize that this journey must traverse a real-world landscape. The real world of politics and poverty, of war and peace, of oppression and liberation. So I want to begin with a little bit of context for Luke's story, and that, of course, would be the context of ancient empire. Now, we can broadly define empire as the rule of the center over the periphery. Folks in Saskatchewan understand that. It turns out that this basic architecture of the real world is germane not only to Luke's gospel story, obviously, but to our own historical moment as well. Here we're going to focus on the ancient reality to prepare for journeying with Luke's Jesus through Lent, but always with an eye toward our own context of center and periphery. Some of you familiar with my work know that I like to show a few images that capture the ethos of ancient empire. This is a 3rd century of the Common Era dedication plaque found in one of the peripheries of the Roman Empire, northern England. You see that it's flanked by 2 relief carvings. At left is Mars, the Roman god of war, brandishing a spear, while at right the mythological hero Hercules holds his club. At the bottom is a running boar, which is the symbol of the 20th Legion, which this is a commemorative plaque for. So it's not hard to see the political function of this kind of public propaganda. Basically, don't mess with us, we will beat you down. Here's another image from Luke's real world. These are 2 coins from the 70s, which would have been probably just before or during the time that Luke is writing his gospel. This is a series of coins that were minted by the Roman Empire in Judea shortly after the destruction of the temple and the crushing of the Judean insurrection. You see on the upper right a woman representing Judea who is sitting under a palm tree representing Palestine with her hands clasped behind her. She's clearly a captive, and on the front side of the coin is a Roman centurion standing victoriously over her. This was the currency that Jews of Luke's time had to go down to the corner store and buy milk and eggs with. It was a constant reminder of their complete vanquishment by the Roman Empire. So that's really important to understand the context of this story. The Bible doesn't take place in Disneyland. It takes place in this real world. Now Luke begins his narrative in chapter 3, which were our readings during Advent, if you recall, by noting that God's word comes not to the high and mighty, but comes to a prophet in the wilderness. Now, we don't know much about John the Baptist outside of the New Testament witnesses, but we do know 2 things that are both corroborated by historians. One, he clearly fashioned himself as a wilderness prophet in the tradition of Elijah, hence the costume of hair shirt and living on what he could scrounge in the wilderness. And secondly, we know from the Jewish historian Josephus, who was a contemporary of the evangelist Luke, that that John was widely perceived as a nationalist dissident. In other words, he was part of the Judean folk who were looking forward to liberation from their captivity under Rome. And that's why Luke alludes to this, that historian Josephus writes that Herod, which is to say Herod Antipas, who was tetrarch of Galilee and Perea between the years 4 and 39, Herod executed John for plainly political reasons. The Baptist preaching was stirring up a popular insurrection. Luke confirms this when he reports in a rather matter-of-fact fashion that Herod had been rebuked by John for all the evil things he had done, and then Herod added this to them all, that he shut John up in prison. So John's relationship with Herod is germane to the Lenten journey, and as we'll see in the second week of Lent, you get Jesus' interaction with Herod. In fact, Luke specifically contrasts John the wilderness prophet with Herod the the ruler. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? Someone dressed in soft robes. Those who put on fine clothing and live in luxury, they live in royal palaces. That's a clear allusion to the Herodians. And that's starkly contrasted with John the prophet. This contrast between kings and prophets will be a theme that reverberates all through the Lenten journey as the lectionary outlines it for us. It's significant that to this dissident, Jesus of Nazareth apprentices himself. This is symbolized by his baptism at a remote desert location in the Jordan River. This location means to remind us of the origins of Israel's faith. The God of Exodus stands outside imperial civilization. That God is undomesticated and wild, most reliably encountered not in the centers of power, but out in the remote spaces. There, John the prophet invites the people into the sacred waters of the Jordan, far from the domesticated ritual baths of the city or the village, and there he invites the people to turn around. This idea of repentance as both a personal and political discipline, of trying to turn around our individual and national projects, is a theme Jesus will take up. So Jesus goes to John, is baptized, takes up John's mantle, and then immediately disappears deeper into the wilderness. So it's Jesus' relationship with John that sets the immediate context for the text that really opens our Lenten journey, the famous narrative of the temptations in the wilderness. Now, during the Lenten season, the church always reflects on this story in the first Sunday of Lent. It's found in both Matthew 4 and Luke 4. In preparation for his mission, Jesus follows a mysterious yet compelling call to wilderness solitude. He fasts. He lives in the wild. He wrestles with spirits. Now, as I said, we're going to focus on this text because I believe it's the hermeneutical key to Luke's entire story, and certainly to the texts that we see in Lent. And so I believe it's also the key to how to preach Luke, not only in Lent, but throughout the year. Now, the fact that Jesus' journey lasts 40 days is clearly intended to invoke the 40-year Exodus wanderings of Israel in the desert after its Egyptian captivity. But what exactly is the connection? Jesus' desert retreat seems strange to our modern ears. Consequently, we've largely ignored this story or spiritualized it, or perhaps in the United Church of Canada, psychologized it in our churchly interpretation. It's just a weird story, and we really don't know what to do with it. It bespeaks, however, of an ancient practice that would be very intelligible to First Nations people, indeed to indigenous peoples the world over. This has been largely lost to our contemporary urban cultures, but it's a tradition that survives still among most land-based tribal people. Among Aborigines in Australia, it is referred to as a renewal of the dreaming. It's a ritual passage into selfhood, somewhere between what Joseph Campbell calls an initiation ceremony and a hero journey. For many North American indigenous people, it is dancing or the sweat lodge. The Pueblo people of New Mexico follow the ancient traditions of the Kiva, and the Sioux and many of the prairie peoples call it Hanblecha, the vision quest. Shamans, writes one anthropologist, with the help of guardian spirits, travel to the land of the dead in order to restore lost or stolen or diseased souls out of their love for their community. So the vision quest is both a very real exterior adventure beyond the margins of society and an interior passage of cleansing. And yet this journey to and in the spirit world is also a sojourn through mythic time in order to encounter the story and the destiny of oneself and one's people. Like Jacob's dream in the desert, Jesus therefore journeys deep into the wilderness, accompanied only by angels. But the fact that the sojourn lasted 40 days obviously invokes Israel's wandering. Jesus is somehow interiorizing the experience of his people, but not in the sense that modern religious existentialists understand it. I want to suggest here that Jesus is mystically retracing the footsteps of his ancestors in order to discover where the journey of his people has gone wrong, as in the tradition of the Vision Quest. In other words, I think Jesus believes that his people had lost their bearings amidst empire, and that course correction can only come through a kind of revisioning of the fateful choices that led liberated Israel back into captivity. In other words, Jesus seeks a radical diagnosis that seeks to move beyond symptoms to the root causes of the crisis of his people. To begin this formidable task, Jesus must return to the place of origins of his people. For Israel, this was the Exodus wilderness, and it is there that Jesus journeys in the Spirit. It's no accident that Luke's temptation narrative follows hard on the heels of Jesus' ancestral genealogy in Luke chapter 3. Israel's distinctive identity commenced when they were sprung by Yahweh from Pharaoh's imperial straitjacket. I will bring my people out of Egypt. This is why, after his baptism by the wilderness prophet John, Jesus is driven by the Spirit deep into the wilderness, where he, like his ancestors, must struggle to discover now what their vocation as a people really means. Fundamental to this identity of Israel was God's warning not to practice the former life ways of their captivity in imperial Egypt. Once liberated, Israel must never again return to those imperial ways. It seems to be that indigenous people understand far better than we do that the wilderness is precisely the place to examine all the ways that we have internalized the pathologies of empire. The wild spaces of nature represent a sort of mirror to us to see how domesticated we have in fact become. Contemporary monks such as Thomas Merton understood that too. He wrote how in the silence of the desert we can more clearly see how Satan has lured us into all the other narratives that constantly compete for our allegiance. The myths of Pharaoh and Caesar and the National Security Council, of Wall Street and Madison Avenue and Hollywood, to use American metaphors. These are all seductive narratives indeed. They promise prosperity, but ultimately deliver only captivity. So I want to take the first of several chat breaks and invite you to name one point of origin that you might return to, particularly as a Canadian, to revisit primal choices. And I want to invite you to think of that either in terms of your own life's journey, or the journey of your church or denomination, or indeed your journey as a Canadian. Just think of one mythic place that you might need to return to on your own vision quest to find out what has gone awry. And I just invite you to, we'll take a minute, I'll stop talking for a minute and just invite you to sort of stream these in your chat box. And you can kind of see what each other are thinking. Just in one phrase, a mythic point of origins that you think you have to go way back to the roots of what has gone wrong, either personally or communally or politically. Again, remind you to use the chat function that I believe is on the lower left of your screen. Beside a river or in a canoe. This is a big one for immigrant people, to revisiting the place of the ancestors by the ocean. Return to the social gospel, which is deep at the roots of the United Church of Canada. Where the St. Lawrence River meets Lake Ontario. So you Canadians, you have so many more great wild spaces. Little Protestant church on a military base. This is a nice mix of wild spaces, built spaces, ancestral spaces. Yeah, that's, I think, the spirit of this vision quest. Virgin prairie, yeah, prairie that has not been plowed up and built over. Yeah, memories and traditions of faith. You see how these spaces, places that we're naming are both deeply personal and yet deeply historical in the journey of a whole people. New York City, Heart of the Beast, summer camp, the table. So I'll let you continue to put down some of these ideas, but that's just trying to get us to get into the spirit here of this journey, this vision quest. So to return to Luke's gospel, in the gospel story, Jesus' distinctive identity, like Israel, is confirmed at his wilderness baptism. You are my child, the beloved. Now, like his ancestors, he's going into the wilderness. The temptation that Jesus faces there, as in the old story, represent a fundamental test of his identity. If you are the child of God, taunts the devil in refrain. This is the question that Jesus and the church that is invited to follow in his footsteps must answer. Are we as a people still defined by the Exodus journey, or have we abandoned it for the seductions of empire? So countless times in the Hebrew Bible, the people are exhorted to remember their liberation. Indeed, the God of Israel is known not so much as creator in the Hebrew Bible as the one who brought you up out of Egypt, a phrase that is used some 25 times in the book of Deuteronomy alone. Now, Jesus' wilderness sojourn is no mere contemplative retreat. He must face the central issues with which the people of God always struggle in our journeys of faith and liberation. The three temptations in our gospel story names the archetypal characteristics of what Walter Wink called the domination system. And they are the economics of exploitation, the politics of empire, and the ideology of entitlement, which most often finds a form in the delusion that God will rescue us, personally or political, no matter what we do. Now, Jesus knows that he can resist these imperial delusions only by staying grounded in the old story. So throughout the temptation narrative, his counter-refrain is, as it is written, as it is written, as it is written. The Gospels re-narrate the Exodus journey as the way of discipleship. And this way begins with a vision quest. It's not a minor skirmish in the desert. It's not a little tune-up before Jesus goes public. In fact, it articulates the central issues which we always and everywhere struggle with, not least in our own time. So let's look at them one by one. Significant that both in Matthew and Luke's versions of this scene, they agree on what the first temptation is. Surrounded by the barren rock of the Judean desert, Jesus hungers, just as his ancestors did in the wilderness. The first temptation is not about sex, as so many church folk would assume. It's about economics, how human beings sustain ourselves materially. The devil invites Jesus to solve this ancient dilemma through the power of exploitation and consumption. In the teeth of this primal temptation to exploit nature for profit, Jesus appeals to the alternative story. Now, many of us North Americans read Jesus' response to mean that we should not be concerned about material or economic life, that spiritual things are more important. We are not supposed to live by bread alone. So comforted, we then go on over-consuming, and that's why we are today in an ecological as well as an economic crisis. But of course, this only reveals our biblical illiteracy. Jesus is countering with the first of 3 citations from the book of Deuteronomy, the book of remembering. In the temptation story, he keeps invoking this, specifically to recall the primal lessons of his ancestors. In this case, the story of the wilderness manna. Here's the text he's quoting from Deuteronomy 8. You see the phrase in yellow that he quotes. And this, of course, is reminding us of the story of the manna in the wilderness. Now, this is an old Exodus tradition, freshly sprung from empire. Anxiety about bread was also Israel's first concern. The whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses. Would that we had died at the Lord's hand as we sat by our flesh pots. You have led us into the desert to kill us with hunger. You see, the Israelites had internalized the appetites and desires of empire, and they could not imagine life apart from their dependence upon the very system that enslaved them. So the famous story in Exodus 16 is not a story about trusting God, as we learned in Sunday school. It's a text that very specifically presents itself as a test to see whether Israel will follow instructions on how to realize Yahweh's alternative economy. And what are these instructions? They are threefold, and they represent the foundation of what I call Sabbath economics. These are the 3 instructions on how to handle the manna. The purpose of economic organization is to guarantee enough for everyone. The gift should be distributed equitably. It should circulate rather than concentrate. And we must keep Sabbath to limit human activity as a reminder of the economy of grace. Not hard to see how crucial such old wisdom is to our current ecological and economic crisis. This was lesson number 1 for Israel of old, and it becomes temptation number 1 that Jesus must revisit in the wilderness. Indeed, this gets reiterated throughout Luke. It provides the foundation for the rest of Jesus' ministry. So, for example, Jesus invokes the lesson of the manna in 2 of the central petitions of the Lord's Prayer. Give us enough bread for today, and release us from debt as we release others. In our work here at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries, we really trying to explore the practical meaning of what we call Sabbath economics for our lives and for the church. We collaborate with people all over North America, including many of you in Canada. We've developed a household covenant using a 12-step model to invite folk to look at how we use money, how we consume, how we work. It's all about economics. These are great disciplines for Lent, personal and political. So I want to get to our second chat break and invite you to do another exercise, and I really I want us to do a little bit of hard work here. It's appropriate to preparing for Lent. I would like you to name one area in which you know that you have given in to the dominant economics of entitlement and exploitation that mark our society. All of us are up to our neck in this, and I just invite you to have courage to just name one thing in your own household, a very personal exercise, an area in which we know that we are struggling with this issue. You know, maybe it's our carbon footprint or our specific consumptive habits, our own addictions and compulsions. Just, again, just chat one phrase of something that you know you're struggling with. as you face that primal of temptations. Clothes made in sweatshops, that's a classic one. Sunday shopping, the end of blue laws, the end of limits to shopping, that's an important one. Too much stuff. In so many ways, that's true. Driving too much, owning two homes. Yeah, these are the kinds of things that the Lenten journey invites us to examine courageously and critically. The accumulation of wealth for retirement, gadgets, technology. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that we have the incredible opportunity during Lent to invite ourselves and our congregations into. And of course, it's contested terrain. The use of time, the internet, these are things that we have to talk about in church. And the Lenten Vision Quest is a great resource, a great time and space to set aside. Lent is way more than chocolate, friends. Okay, let's move on to the second temptation. We're about halfway through our time. This escalates the conflict and retraces the next stage in the apostasy of Israel and of the church. Satan parades all the kingdoms of the world before Jesus and offers to grant him jurisdiction over them, as a vassal king, of course. The narrative here is very matter-of-fact in its analysis of state power. First, the notion that a pantheon of principalities could be viewed in a moment suggests that all forms of centralized political hegemony are essentially the same. You've seen one, you've seen them all. Secondly, there's no question in Luke's mind that they are all administered under the authority of the devil himself, and he can deliver them to whoever he wishes. Wow. Would that our churches could maintain such a clear perspective on the state as a principality. We're not very clear on that, but the Bible is. It has a deep suspicion of empire woven into the very earliest traditions. Near Eastern antiquity was dominated, and Israel was geopolitically surrounded by powerful city-states, from Egypt to Babylon to Assyria. These highly hierarchical societies were rightly perceived by the Hebrew storytellers to be dangerous and predatory. From the time Abraham was called out of Ur, the Bible has been the story of God's people struggling to survive and remain faithful in successive cauldrons of empire, as recently summarized by Richard Horsley. Whether we consider the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, the prophets speaking truth to Babylonian and Persian rulers, or Jesus and the early church contesting the omnipotent claims of Rome, the story has always been essentially the same. It's about how we follow the way of justice and mercy, the way of Torah in the Hebrew Bible, the way of discipleship in the Second Testament, in a world defined by empire and its violent discontents. This is why your church, the United Church of Canada, some years ago, named empire as the essential context for evangelism and discipleship in our time. I believe they were right about that. From the beginning, the Bible identifies the artificial heights of imperial architecture, symbolized by the mythological site of Babel's Tower, with the archetypal symbol of imperial hubris. Israel's prophets longed for Yahweh's destruction of such empire. It's for this reason that the initial polity of Israel was explicitly anti-monarchic. Exodus lesson number 2. The Israelite confederacy consisted of 12 self-determining tribes with local adjudicators called judges, loosely consociated under a Yahwistic covenant, as has been studied most revealingly by the great Hebrew Bible scholar Norman Gottwald, a dear friend and mentor of mine. He summarizes the origins of Israel in the, quote, in the middle, people coming together to sort of forge an alternative society, an intertribal community over and against the surrounding empires. This was the original vision. It's the second great plot line in Israel's history, the struggle to maintain their alternative form of social organization under pressure from within and from without to conform to the dominant political paradigm of monarchy. This is captured in the story of Gideon, the hero of Israel's campaigns in Canaan. His grateful people wanted to make this general into a king, and Gideon refuses, insisting that Yahweh alone is Israel's king. But of course, others do not follow his lead, and soon in the story, Israel is begging the prophets to anoint a king, as is narrated in the famous story of 1 Samuel 8. Israel's fateful turn from their vocation is narrated here. A community settled in Palestine gathers again to complain, demanding a king to govern, and the elder Samuel, representing the old prophetic judges' federation, warns of the dire consequences of such a political project. It means the construction of a military machine, compulsory conscription. It means that the economy will be expropriated through eminent domain, oppressive taxation. This depressing litany concludes with the chilling words, "In that day you will cry out because of your king whom you chose. But this time God will not hear you." The lesson, if we voluntarily submit to domination, God cannot hear our lament. It's one of the hardest texts in all of Scripture. So Jesus, in his vision quest, returns to this archetypal crossroads in the belly of the Roman Empire, and he rehabilitates the old insistence upon the exclusive sovereignty of Yahweh. This time his defense is taken from the great Deuteronomic Shema, "Hear, O Israel." "Take care that you do not forget Yahweh," warns the Deuteronomist, "who brought you out of Egypt. The Lord your God you shall fear and serve, by God's name alone." So this is Jesus again going to that archetypal crossroads. Interestingly, Jesus later reiterates this very same point in the second petition of the Lord's Prayer, "May your sovereignty be restored." To pray this prayer delegitimizes every other jurisdiction, a point not lost on Pontius Pilate and the Judean authorities, as we'll see. Most importantly, Jesus subverted all conventional expectations of what true leadership consists of in his call to his disciples to aspire downward, to lead by service, and to take up not the sword, but the cross. In all of these ways, Jesus is revisiting lesson number 2. Do not serve empire. So now I invite you to a third chat break. Obviously, empire has more deeply shaped my country than yours, but you Canadians are not immune. And just as in the last break we talked about personal struggles, I want to challenge you to name in a phrase one way in which you think you as a nation has compromised your character by gazing on the kingdoms of the world and trying to ape your southern neighbor or collaborate with imperial behavior. I'm sure some of you have some thoughts on this, so let's take a minute and talk about that second temptation as it reflects through Canadian history. It's a little more difficult in our churches to name some of these things. We are better at the personal than the political, but it's very, very important that we have the courage to do this, and Lent, again, is an opportunity for us to name some things. In the land of idle no more, I think there's lots going on here. So certainly it's been named the long legacy with Aboriginal people. Security certificates, disregard for treaties, willingness to abandon social programs in the name of fiscal responsibility. The few few policies with their current administration that could be named here. Oil development at the expense of the environment, that's a huge one. The tar sands, the whole world is watching to see what's going to happen with the tar sands. Not only how it's being developed, but where it's going to be shipped. In embracing the idea that peace can be achieved through violence, yeah, the way that Canada has faithfully followed along in all the imperial wars of the West. The active limiting of our right to democratic demonstration, that's a big one, and it's attempting to silence non-profits. Japanese internment camps, a shameful legacy your country shares with mine. Well, it turns out it wasn't too hard to come up with a long list. Loss of democratic process. And on we go. What would it mean for Lent to be a time where we can actually broach some of these subjects in our churches, to allow our people to surface some of these anxieties and the ways in which we have followed the second temptation? Well, let's move on to the third temptation. What an extraordinary preface to this final test of character. We're told the devil transports Jesus to Jerusalem and sets him on the pinnacle of the temple. Satan with Jesus in tow, the evil one with access to the holiest place, the fallen angel quoting Scripture. It ought to give us pause about every religious claim to represent God. But this story reminds us that evil knows that behind every political economy is a theology, a sacred canopy that is thrown over a regime to lend it cosmic legitimation. And of course, our churches have too long and too deeply been complicit with that. So, Satan turns the tables on Jesus and begins thumping his version of the Bible. Perhaps we can think of this as a sort of presidential or prime ministerial prayer breakfast. The text that is chosen and interpreted is Psalm 91. Indeed, that's a powerful statement of God's protection of those who abide, but it can all too easily be misunderstood, like so much of Scripture. And it has been. When read through the hermeneutics of power and privilege, Psalm 91 becomes a tune of entitlement, a hymn to invulnerability, and finally, an ode to the Reich. We have seen how A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, based on Psalm 91, became a marching tune for the Nazis, and thus truly what Phyllis Tribble calls a text of terror. This strand of political theology has prevailed in many times throughout history, not least under the Israelite monarchy, as it has in every Christian empire since. What Jesus confronts here in this last temptation is the ultimate form of idolatry, identifying God's name with our historical project. That somehow our forces will prevail, though 1,000 fall at your side. Psalm 91, verse 7, a favorite verse of military chaplains. Waving this psalm in Jesus' face, the devil urges Jesus to take the fall for empire. And what a vantage point he offers. On the rooftop of the greatest second temple of Herod, above the gleaming capital city of Jerusalem, the center of Israel's universe. It is, of course, a symbolic perch, the highest place of the dwelling place of the Most High. Psalm 91:9. In other words, we are at the heart of the matter now. And Satan assures Jesus that nothing will possibly happen to him, for he will be borne aloft because of his people's ethnocentric theology of entitlement. You see, the first temple was originally envisioned as a storehouse for the redistribution of the community's surplus. But over time it became the mechanism by which power, wealth, and privilege concentrated in the hands of an elite. Instead of a place where sacrifice were offered on behalf of the people in thanksgiving for the gift, it became a place where the people were sacrificed to the state. So the prophets railed against God's hijacked house. Do not trust in the delusional words, "This is the temple of the Lord." It has become an institution of robbery. Luke's Jesus will have occasion to not only cite these words, but to reenact them at the heart of the temple in his exorcism later in Luke's story. So one final time, Jesus clings to the Deuteronomist. You shall not test the Lord as you did at Massah. He unmasks the devil's attempt to reverse the divine mandate. It is not God who attends to our demands. It is we who attend to the values of God. So the argument comes full circle, because Massah was the place of testing. It was the place where Israel was tested around the wilderness wandering, about bread and about power. The I Am is no nation's patron, but the animator of the only redemptive historical project, human liberation. And this, too, is cited in the Lord's Prayer, the leading petition of which is, may your name remain uncompromised, and do not lead us into temptation. In the United States, too many Christians believe that God will back up our empire and bail us out simply because we are the instruments of civilization. From the city on a hill of the Puritans to Manifest Destiny, to the conquest of our continent, to the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we have imagined ourselves as on a divinely appointed mission, historically favored, utterly convinced of our own nobility. And in the wake of such self-assurance has come a long string of imperial adventures and the inevitable body count of the innocents. And our churches at every step have been complicit. And I dare say, yours as well. Today we live in the most idolatrous of ages, with nuclear weapons and genetic engineering and climate change. So, what does our resistance to the third temptation mean? This radical Yahwist principle of non-identification between God and our project. It's the first commandment. It is the third temptation. So again, one more time, I invite you to name a way. And here we've done something personal, we've done something political. I want you to name a way in which the United Church of Canada is still infected by the virus of entitlement, expecting that it as an institution will survive no matter what, just because God founded it. This is a tough one, but nobody said Lent was easy. And I invite you now to type in some phrases about ways in which we still struggle with this in our churches today. Yeah, I think brick and mortar is a big one. We cling to brick and mortar more tightly than to the gospel. And of course, it goes beyond brick and mortar. It goes to our institutional preservation, toning down our political endeavors to keep our charity status, something that your prime minister would love to take from you. Yeah. Clinging to the good old days, the golden era when our churches were full and our buildings were big. Overlooking opportunities to collaborate with each other, especially with outreach efforts, with other churches, with other United Church of Canada churches, or other denominations, or other groups in the community. Memorial plaques, well, you could move on to stained glass windows and all the rest of it, the long history of collaboration with government projects, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. You're a very courageous group of 14 folk, being willing to name the political, the personal, and the ecclesial. These are challenging things, and yet the invitation at Lent is to face our fears and to go back into the roots of our captivity. I really believe that Lent is a magnificent invitation to a new way of being church. It is edgy, and so good for the Edge webinar series to tackle this one. Well, let's just close the circle here. Our strange gospel story in Luke 4 concludes with a somber epilogue. Having failed to seduce Jesus, the devil departs, seeking a more opportune time. This is Luke's pointed reminder that there will be more crossroads for God's people to face in the future. But the word here, interestingly, is kairos, that pregnant term used in the Gospels to connote the moment of consequential choice. And these moments obviously face us today. You in Canada have the great advantage of having a wonderful ecumenical organization that is specifically built to help your congregation discern the kairos. And of course, I'm speaking of Kairos Canada. You have in your notes section the URL. If you're not familiar with Kairos Canada, it's a resource I encourage you to draw on in your personal, congregational, and political work. The temptation narrative has named 3 archetypal themes at the outset of Lent, inviting and challenging us to discern what they mean for our churches today. In the readings throughout the rest of Lent, the same themes keep cropping up. So we really have an opportunity to debrief the wilderness temptations throughout the whole arc of Lent. We don't have to try to get all of this in the first Sunday. And indeed, we'll need a lot of time and attention to probe the depths of this. So I want to just briefly name the remaining Sundays of Lent. In the second Sunday of Lent, you have this extraordinary vignette of Jesus' clearest interface with the political powers of his time prior to his confrontation in Jerusalem at the end of the story. Here he skirmishes with Herod Antipas, and it's interesting that he's warned that Herod is after him, and the Nazarene's response is to call Herod a fox. It's not a compliment, it's a political epithet, recognizing the predatory nature of power. Jesus refuses to be intimidated, simply reiterating the salient characteristics of his ministry of healing and liberation. He then goes on to assert the alternative to Herodian politics of domination, namely the tradition of Israelite prophecy. From beginning to end of Luke's story, the prophet is the counterpoint to the king. Jesus, however, is a realist. He knows the fate of prophets, a terrible truth that extends into our own time, from Martin Luther King to Oscar Romero. And then in verse 34, Jesus launches into the first of 4 laments over Jerusalem in the course of Luke's story. It is a very maternal lament. He wishes he could gather his people like a brood. Don't miss the irony. Herod is a fox, Jesus is a mother hen, and the chickens are in danger. In the third Sunday of Lent, we get another interesting vignette, again highly political, that intensifies the portrait of Jesus as a public political interlocutor. This text, which I haven't reproduced here, it's a longer text, but you'll find when you look at your lectionary, reminds us of the real political terrain that Jesus was walking. There are 2 references. One is to the Roman procurator Pilate having mingled the blood of some Galileans with their sacrifices. Clearly a reference to some incident in Jerusalem in which the Roman authorities killed some pilgrims down from the north who had come to offer their loyalty to the Judean temple, probably at Passover. This is something that in this era of revolution and counterinsurgency were constantly bubbling just under the surface. We know from the historian Josephus that these skirmishes occurred many times. We also know that Pilate prevailed every time. Jesus' response is to refuse to protest just this isolated incident. Rather, he reframes the problem, saying that it's really the whole project that is fundamentally flawed. And unless we can turn this entire project around, repent, we'll all go down. Similarly, a second incident which names a tower that fell on some people, probably a allusion to some bad building practices as the result of sweetheart contracting deals among the elites. Again, Jesus redirects the attention of people from the isolated incident to the deeper issues. We've got to turn the whole project around. Third Lent is a fantastic opportunity to name some of these issues that come up in the temptation narrative. And yet, the second half of the text of Third Lent is a parable about patience. It's a beautiful story in which a tenant farmer pleads to an impatient landowner for just a little bit more time to get a newly planted fig tree to yield. The fig tree, of course, was an archetypal symbol of the Judean nation. Here we see Jesus' human compassion as a prophet. He knows things are bad, and yet he desperately wants more time to try to turn things around. Remember, friends, prophets yell at their people not because they hate them, but because they love them so profoundly and long so passionately for change and redemption. These kinds of texts invite us to explore the biblical dialectic of the prophetic and the pastoral. And then right in the middle of Lent, on Fourth Lent, we get the famous story of the prodigal son. And I just want to make a suggestion here and give a challenge to you preachers. You know the story of the prodigal son. Most everybody in the congregation knows it too. You got the two sons, the older son who stays home and does the right thing, and the younger son who goes out and squanders the inheritance. And sometimes it helps to give a different twist to familiar stories to bring them back to life. So I'd like to invite you to look at the prodigal son in light of our ecological disaster. And I'd like you to take a book out of indigenous people. You know, some native people talk about we Westerners as the clueless younger sibling who are exploiting the world to death. And we are the sick ones, and we need to come back to our senses. What would the prodigal son's story look like if we as Western immigrant colonizers who continue to colonize the earth and squander it, what would it mean if we read the story as about us, the prodigals? There's good news that the Creator loves even those of us who have squandered the inheritance. But in order to reconnect with that grace, we are going to have to stop the squandering and return to the original vision of the household, to Sabbath economics. I think you can have a lot of fun with that during the fourth Sunday in Lent. In Fifth Lent, you have the story of the anointing woman. It's a beautiful story. It's one of the few stories that appears in all four Gospels. Here, for a rather odd reason, we get John's version of the story, which is a little too bad because I like Luke's version of the story the best, that we find in Luke chapter 7. You do get a chance to preach on Luke 7 during the season of Pentecost in the 11th week of Pentecost. But in John's version, you have Martha and Lazarus, two characters, reappearing over a meal, and you have the famous commendation of the woman who understands the economics of service. It's a beautiful opportunity to revisit temptation number one, to embrace the economics of enough and the economics of solidarity. And finally, in the last Sunday of Luke, which is Palm Sunday, you get the story of the so-called triumphal entry. Now, this is This is the most political of stories, even though we've sentimentalized it. And would that we had time to go over it in detail. We don't, but if you're really interested in looking at this kind of an approach to these texts, we are doing our own webinar, BCM, on March 19th. That is revisioning this text, looking at the political and economic context of Jesus' march on Jerusalem. If you want to check that out, the URL for that is in your note box. It's a really important story, and Palm Sunday can really be a time to experiment with public liturgy. It is one of the few times when people are supposed to get up out of the pews and wave palm branches. What would it mean for us to do our own little march into public space? Because Palm Sunday didn't take place originally in the safety of a sanctuary. It was right into the teeth of the imperial city. What would it mean for us to animate that sort of experiment in public liturgy coming out of our own traditions and some of the concerns that you have named, personal, communal, and political? I'd love to see some of those connections be made. Again, Kairos Canada is a great resource for trying to think imaginatively about some of those things. We are at our hour, and so I want to pause there, and maybe our friends at Edge will allow 5 or 7 minutes. If anybody's got a pressing question of clarification, Rob, I'm going to leave this up to you, but I'm happy to stick around for just a few minutes if we want to have any final
that's great, and we're happy to leave the room open for those that are able to stay and engage in some conversation. And thank you, Ched, for offering to stay with the group that wants to continue. In the meantime, in case there are some that need to be getting on, let me express my thanks. I'm always amazed, Ched, how you can take such a rich kind of tradition and the complex issues and help us look at it within a very coherent framework of some clear principles. Very, 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 very helpful to me again this time. For those that we would very much appreciate your input and feedback to help us continue to develop this this way of engaging more fully. You'll see in a few minutes some polls come up on the screen for your immediate response, but for the next few minutes at least, please feel free to continue to engage with questions in the chat box. I'll just lift up, Christina's not sure about the 20th versus the 19th of March. 19th, okay, great. Okay, it's already been changed. Sharon's got that. Great. Yeah, so thanks again, and for those that would like to, please continue to chat, and again, on everyone's behalf, let me express my thanks, Ched.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for taking time to
I'm
do
going to
this
put the
kind of preparation.
Up, and I'm
hang out for a few
hoping
minutes
the chat can continue, but we'll see. If not, we'll put the chat back on. Great. There we are. So feel free to chat and express, give your feedback there.
Now, the question, Brenna, as to who was the author that named the temptation types, there are many people who have written on these questions from a sort of political mode, and one of the first people, I think, to do this in a really engaging way was the great Clarence Jordan in some of his work in the 1960s. He was one of the people to make the connections, the social and political connections of the wilderness temptations. I also want to draw your attention. The note box has gone away. Maybe we could restore that. There is some links to an article that gives some secondary literature and some resources from our website on this text.
Yeah, we'll get that up.
If you want to look at that, if we can get that notes page back up with that link. Great, thank you.
At least we'll try. Not sure if Sharon might be trying it at the same time. Here we are. Get that out of the presenter area. Is this the one, Chad? Yeah, great. I think we're all there.
Yep, that's the one. If
is that the bit.li?
Yeah, actually, it looks like
one?
The link to the article's been lost. So let me
No.
let me go ahead and put it back up there. No, I'll restore it.
I'll ask Sharon if you could respond to Maribeth around how to submit the poll answers. I think you just click on the buttons there. Yeah. Thanks, Sharon. So also just to remind folks of our webinar coming up next week for congregations that are looking at partnerships and collaborative ways of being in mission with other United Church or other congregations. Some folks with some experience on the amalgamation process and how to do that well. Rick Balson and David Sherwin. Chet, I wasn't sure if you responded. I may have been busy with other things around congregations not so identified with privilege. Not sure how many.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm just seeing that now. Yeah, thanks. Well, you know, that's a great question, and I think it's important to recognize the complex landscape of privilege. Not everybody has it. Not everybody who assumes they have it has it, and not everyone who doesn't assume they have it doesn't have it. And it's hard to talk about, and it's good to talk about. Particularly in the safe place of our churches, because of course privilege comes in lots of different colors and classes and social locations and genders and sexual orientations and so on. So it's important that we learn how to talk about the complex interface between different kinds of entitlement and privilege or lack thereof. And then it's important to, as we identify ways in which we perhaps have experienced marginalization or are experiencing that, to understand one of the ways in which our marginalization functions is that we interiorize the values of privilege. So a real typical example of this is the way in which poor folk who can't afford a big screen TV are nevertheless socialized to desire a big screen TV. And of course that's just writ large across the culture. And part of liberation is to do the difficult interior and exterior work to see the ways in which our minds and hearts and spirits and pocketbooks and life choices are colonized by the priorities and values and narratives of the most privileged. It really, I believe that these texts aren't just for folk who have experienced privilege. I think they're for all of us because we all live in a society where these delusions are beamed 24/7. And then it's important to, as we do that liberative work, that decolonizing of our minds and hearts, that we begin to ask ourselves, so what is the alternative? And how do we embody an alternative that isn't just trying to pull ourselves into the dominant system, but actually trying to embrace an alternative way of being human? And that's where, of course, people on the margins have everything to teach the rest of us. So I really think these questions open up some important terrain to talk across class and across gender and across race and so on.
Attendees are typing apparently around that. So, Chet,
Marjorie, thank you.
What is on the horizon?
You're asking, is privilege wanting God to do our will? Yeah, I think that's the essence of the third temptation, is putting God at our service. And we do that in small ways with our little prayers and hopes, and we obviously do that in grand collective ways. And as I say, it's just really crucial that we be able to face this both at the local level and at the national level. Well, I think, Rob, this is probably good. Thanks everybody for sticking on, and be sure and click the poll.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Rob, again for the invitation. We'll see you next time.